Hello, this is Mr. Ruby, and this is a reading of Genetics. Inheriting Traits. Do you look like one parent or a grandparent? Do you have your father's eyes? What about Aunt Isabel's cheekbones, eye color, nose shape, or many other physical features are some of the traits that are inherited from parents, as seen in Figure 1 shows. An organism is a collection of traits all inherited from its parents. Heredity is the passing down of traits from parent to offspring. What controls traits? Let's look at this question. What is genetics? Generally, genes on chromosomes control an organism's form and function. The different forms of traits that a gene may have are called alleles. When a pair of chromosomes separate during meiosis, alleles for each trait also separate into different sex cells. As a result, every sex cell has one allele for each trait, as shown in Figure 2. The allele in one sex cell may control one form of the trait, such as having facial dimples. The allele in the other sex cell may control different forms of traits, like not having dimples. The study of how traits are inherited through interactions of alleles is the science of genetics. Mendel, the father of genetics. Did you know that an experiment with pea plants helped scientists understand why our eyes are the color they are? Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk who studied mathematics and science, but became a gardener in a monastery. His interest in plants began as a boy in his father's orchard, where he could predict the possible types of flowers and fruits that would result from crossbreeding two plants. Curiosity about the connection between color of a pea flower and the type of seed the same plant produced inspired him to begin experimenting with garden peas in 1856. Mendel made careful use of scientific methods, which resulted in the first recorded study of how traits pass from one generation to the next. After 8 years, Mendel presented his results with pea plants to scientists. Before Mendel, science mostly relied on observation and description, and often studied many traits at one time. Mendel was the first to trace one trait through several generations. He also was the first to use mathematics of probability to explain heredity. The use of math in plant science was a new concept and not widely accepted then. Mendel's work was forgotten for a long time. In 1900, 3 plant scientists working separately reached the same conclusion as Mendel. Each plant scientist had discovered Mendel's writings while doing his own research. Since then, Mendel has been known as the father of genetics. Genetics in a garden. Each time Mendel studied a trait, he crossed 2 plants with different expressions of the trait. He found that the new plant all looked like one of the 2 parents. He called these new plants hybrids because they received different genetic information or different alleles from a trait from each parent. The result of these studies made Mendel even more curious about how traits are inherited. Garden peas are easy to breed for pure traits. An organism that always produces the same trait generation after generation is called a purebred. For example, tall plants that always produce seeds that produce tall plants are purebred for the trait of tall height. Table 1 shows other pea plant traits that Mendel studied. Dominant and recessive factors. In nature, insects randomly pollinate plants as they move from flower to flower. In his experiment, Mendel used pollen from the flowers of purebred tall plants to pollinate by hand the flowers of purebred short plants. This process is called cross-pollination. He found that tall plants crossed with short plants produced seeds that produced all tall plants. Whatever caused the plants to be short had disappeared. Mendel called the tall form the dominant factor because it dominated or covered up the short form. He called the form that seemed to disappear the recessive factor. Today, these are called dominant alleles and recessive alleles. What happened to the recessive form? Figure 3 answers this question. Figure 3. Gregor Mendel discovered that experiment he carried out on garden plants provided understanding of heredity. For 8 years, he crossed plants that had different characteristics and recorded those characteristics were passed from generation to generation. One such characteristic or trait was the color of pea pods. The results of Mendel's experiment on pea pods colors are shown below. One of the so-called parent plants in Mendel's experiment had pods that were green, a dominant trait. The other plant had pods that were yellow, a recessive trait. Mendel discovered that the two parents produced a generation of plants with green pods. The recessive color yellow did not appear in any pods. Next, Mendel collected seeds from the first generation plants and raised the second generation. He discovered that these second generation plants produced plants with either green or yellow pods in a ratio of about 3 plants with green pods to 1 plant with yellow pods. The recessive trait had reappeared. This 3-to-1 ratio proved remarkably consistent in hundreds of similar crosses, allowing Mendel to accurately predict the ratio of pod color of the second generation of plants. Using probability to make predictions. If you and your sister can't agree on what movie to see, you could solve the problem by tossing a coin. When you toss a coin, you're dealing with probabilities. Probability is a branch of mathematics that helps you to predict the chance that something will happen. If your sister chooses tails while the coin is in the air, what is the probability the coin will land tail side up? Because the coin has 2 sides, there are 2 possible outcomes, heads or tail. One outcome is tails, therefore the probability of one side of the coin showing is 1 out of 2, or 50%. Mendel also dealt with probabilities. One of the things that made the predictions of accurate and was worked with large numbers of plants. He studied almost 30,000 pea plants over a period of 8 years. By doing so, Mendel increased the chances of seeing repeatable pattern. Valid scientific conclusions need to be based on results that can be duplicated. Punnett squares. Suppose you wanted to know what colors of pea plants you would get if you pollinated white flowers on one pea plant with pollen from purple flowers on a different plant. How can you predict the offspring will look like without making the cross? A handy tool used to predict the result is Mendelian genetics is Punnett square. In a Punnett square, letters represent dominant and recessive alleles. An uppercase letter stands for a dominant allele. A lowercase letter stands for a recessive allele. The letters are forms of a code. They show the genotype or genetic makeup of an organism. Once you understand the letters mean, you can tell a lot about the inheritance of a trait in an organism. The way an organism looks and behaves as a result of its genotype is its phenotype, as shown in Figure 4. If you have a brown hair, then the phenotype of your hair color is brown. Alleles determine traits. Most cells in your body have 2 alleles for every trait. These alleles are located on chromosomes within the nucleus of a cell. An organism with 2 alleles are the same as homozygous. For Mendel's P's, this would be written as capital T, homozygous for tall dominant trait, or lowercase t, homozygous for short recessive trait. An organism that has two different alleles for a trait is called heterozygous. The hybrid plant Mendel produced were all heterozygous for height, capital T, lowercase t. Making a Punnett square. In a Punnett square, for predicting one trait, the letters represent two alleles from one parent are written on the top of the grid and one letter per section. Those of the second place are on the side of the grid with one letter per section. Each square on the grid is filled in with one allele donated by each parent. The letters that you use to fill in each square represents the genotype possible for the offspring that the plants could produce. This activity shows the cross between a black dog and a blonde dog. Principles of heredity. Even though Gregor Mendel didn't know anything about DNA, genes, or chromosomes, he succeeded in beginning to describe the mathematical represents how inherited traits are passed from parent to offspring. He realized that some factors in the pea plants produce certain traits. Mendel also concluded that these factors separated when pea plants reproduce. Mendel arrived at his conclusions after years of detailed observations, careful analysis, and repeated experimentation. Table 2 summarizes Mendel's principles of heredity. Table 2. Principles of heredity. 1. Traits are controlled by alleles or in chromosomes. 2. An allele is affected in dominant or recessive. 3. When a pair of chromosomes separates during meiosis, the different alleles for a trait move into separate sex cells. This has been a reading of Section 1 Genetics. I'm Mr. Ruby. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you find this helpful.